Welcome to Below the Forest Floor. My name is Nancy, and today we are going to be talking about the famous haunted railroad tracks of San Antonio, Texas. As a San Antonio native, I grew up around stories about the haunted railroad tracks, from kids at school talking about them to my own mom, even hearing about it on the news and around Halloween time. It's become such a popular attraction that I've seen on the Science Channel, and I've seen so many cars there at a time where it got to the point that it wasn't even really scary during my personal visit, but we'll get to that later. I wanted to start off by talking about the original legend or legends of the San Antonio train tracks, and then we can talk about my mom's personal story, my personal story, which is just not really a story, just more of a funny situation that happened, and we can get into the reality of it, because I learned a lot of things about the San Antonio railroad tracks that a lot of people may not know. According to the book When Darkness Falls, Tales of San Antonio Ghosts and Hauntings, this all started when a school bus on the south side of San Antonio was taking a bunch of kids home, and the bus stalled on the train tracks. And when the person who was driving the bus was trying to get the bus to start up again, a train was coming and it couldn't stop. The bus wouldn't start. So the train hit the bus with the children on it. In this book, it talks about the time period being around the 30s or the 40s. It doesn't give a specific time or date stamp. It mostly just talks about how there wasn't a lot of information or actual news reports about it that they could find at all. So they didn't really write a lot in the book about it, but they did need to mention it, or they felt like they needed to mention it because it's such a famous story from San Antonio. Now, in the story that I just told you guys about, it was about 5 in the afternoon when the train hit the bus. But in another legend, it was actually a rainy Texas morning. In the last story, it didn't specify how many children had passed when the train hit the bus, but in this one about the rainy Texas morning, it specifies that 10 children passed away in this terrible accident. Then there's the story that's on the GhostCityTours.com website. The first story that they have on their website does have to do with all the basic information you heard from the other two stories, but where it gets really interesting is the second story. In this version of the story, it was a nun who was driving the school bus, and the kids that were on the bus had fallen asleep. Well, when the bus stalled out on the train tracks, she was trying to start the bus again without the kids waking up. She didn't want to wake up the kids. They'd had a long drive, and she was trying to be nice about it. So she was just trying to get the bus to start going. Well, what she didn't realize was that a train was on its way, and by the time she saw the train, it was too late. Train hit the bus. She survived, kids didn't, and it left her completely broken. She was so broken, in fact, that she actually went back to the site where the kids passed away and decided that she wanted to end her life the way they passed. So she parked her car on the railroad tracks and was waiting for the next train to come. And right before the train actually made its way to her car, she felt the car begin to move on its own. By the time she knew it, she was no longer on the tracks, and she was very confused as to what might have just happened. She walked out of her car to go see if there was any evidence of somebody trying to help her, and when she went to the back of her car to look to see if there's anyone around, she didn't see anybody. But what she did see was some small handprints on the back of her car, which she assumed were her students, trying to save her from the same fate that they suffered. Now, I remember my mom telling me stories about the railroad tracks when I was younger. Like, she would always tell me about that there was kids and that they passed away on the railroad tracks because the train hit the bus. But there wasn't always a lot of detail. That was just the story that I always heard. That was the story that a lot of kids heard. And then one day, my mom actually told me about her personal experience, which I have written down for you guys today. So sit back, relax, and get ready to hear someone's real life experience with the railroad tracks. One night, my friends and I had been partying, and one of them suggested that we go to the railroad tracks. I asked why, and they said because the ghosts of little kids were going to push the car over the tracks. I was skeptical, but said sure, why not? Well, when we were getting close to the tracks, our car stalled. It stopped working completely. So I asked my friend what happened, and he said that he wasn't sure, that it had never happened before. Well, we all got out of the car and started trying everything we could think of to get it to start working again. We were looking under the hood, we were checking the tires. We couldn't find anything that was wrong with the actual car. It just would not start. So after about an hour of messing with the car, it just all of a sudden turned back on again. We weren't sure what we did to fix it, but it was on, so we didn't really ask too many questions. We went over the train tracks and we were completely surprised when absolutely nothing happened. It was a little weird because we kind of assumed that the car stalling was foreshadowing for something worse to happen, but there was nothing, and so we just went on about our business and we left. We decided to go back the next day because there was no way we were going to miss out on this experience, but this time we came prepared with baby powder to see if we could get some evidence in case the car was moved. So we parked over the train tracks, got out, put baby powder all around the back of the trunk, and then we got back in and put the car in neutral, and then we waited. All of a sudden, it began to move. We panicked a little, but I personally honestly thought it was just gravity because of us getting out and then back in, and it was on neutral. We were on a little hill, so I didn't think a lot of it. So we left the area just thinking it was all gravity, and people who thought that it was ghosts pushing the car were crazy, and that we were just going to go clean up the car somewhere else. So we made our stop, and then we got out to go and clean up the back of the car, and when we walked behind the car, we found tiny little fingerprints embedded in the baby powder. We freaked out, and from that day forward, I definitely believe that the train tracks were haunted. I heard this story a lot growing up, so obviously I was super excited to go to the train tracks myself one day in the dark and experience what she went through. So I went on a date with this guy and I told him I want to go to the haunted railroad tracks at night, and he was like, are you sure? It was literally our first date. I never saw the guy again after this, and I was like, yes, that's where I want to go. And I'm pretty sure he thought I was just a crazy person. He was like, I guess. It was about 7 o'clock at night, and I'm super excited. We have the GPS going, and he's quiet the whole time. And we get there, and it is packed full of people. It is such a huge line. It looks like a McDonald's on a very busy night. And there's absolutely nothing creepy about it. And I am a scaredy cat. I get scared at the littlest things. And I just couldn't get into it. And the worst part was, it was bright. It was so bright because of how many cars were there at that time of the night. And there was a cop there moving people along because people were waiting for too long on the railroad tracks for anything to happen. So they actually had someone there moving traffic along because people were taking too long on the railroad tracks waiting for the car to do something. It was extremely boring. Got to our turn. I put the car on the tracks, waited about a minute. Cop looked at me, gestured for me to move along, and it was over. That was it. I went and dropped the guy off. Never saw him again. That was the most boring night of my life. And so for me personally, I never got the experience that my mom had, and I was a little jealous, to be quite honest. Now you guys know, with all of these episodes, I like to do some research into the backstory behind the supernatural. I try to find out dates and times of why and when certain situations happen. Well, I've got some really interesting information from the San Antonio train tracks, and why some people may not have experiences that others do. I do believe that there may be something going on at the San Antonio train tracks due to the fact that there are a lot of deaths that happen in San Antonio, almost daily at times. So that could be one reason that these hauntings do happen. But I don't think it's because of a school bus, and I don't think it's because of a group of children that passed away there. According to any kind of information I could find on the internet, it was not in San Antonio at all. This is a real situation that happened with a group of children, but it happened in Salt Lake City, Utah, Thursday, December 1st, 1938. And the reason that it got mixed up with San Antonio was because one of the San Antonio newspapers published this story, and people saw the headline about children getting hit by a bus, and they assumed it was in San Antonio because they probably didn't read any further than just the headline. Now people may be asking, well, if the kids didn't pass away on the railroad tracks here in San Antonio, Texas, why are the street names named after kids? Well, there's a very good reason for that. The area that was built there near the train tracks, called McCrillis Heights, have street names after children because the person who built the area, Mr. McCrillis himself, actually named the streets after his own grandchildren, and this was actually confirmed by a San Antonio historian on the Science Channel a little while back. On that episode, they also debunked a couple of other things that people may not know about. So people get a little confused when their car rolls over the train tracks, as it looks like you're going up a hill, when in reality it's actually going down a hill, and it's a 2-foot drop, but due to an optical illusion, it doesn't seem that way. So when your car rolls forward, you're expecting it to not do that, and that's what makes you think someone's actually pushing it, and because it's in neutral, it's obviously going to move. Don't believe me? They actually had a group of surveyors go up there and tested it. And last but not least, the screaming children. Now, I personally never heard of screaming children at the railroad tracks, but other people have claimed to have heard it. One very strange explanation for that is peacocks. Yeah, peacocks. They are apparently a very popular animal to be kept in San Antonio, and there is a small peacock farm not too far from these railroad tracks, according to the San Antonio historian that was speaking about all of these different things. And if you start thinking to yourself, how do peacocks sound like children screaming? They do. It is scary. My family, my husband and my little brother and I actually heard it one night in our neighborhood, and we lived in a very, very poor side of town, and there was this house on the corner that had these huge metal walls. We didn't even know someone lived there. It was a very tall house, very secretive. We never saw people go in or out of it, and they had the fence completely sealed. There was not even a crack that you could look through. And one night when we were driving home from picking up my brother from work, we heard what we thought was, at first we thought it was a monkey. It legit sounded like we were at the zoo while we were driving by this area. So we went back around and we recorded it, and we found out later that was the sound of a peacock. So there's a peacock in our old neighborhood. Just letting you know, Mom, if you're listening to this, there's a peacock in our neighborhood. And I know it sounds like super crazy and weird that there's so many little coincidences that create this story and that has kept this story alive for so long. With a peacock farm, that sounds like something someone would make up. It sounds like something out of like a Scooby-Doo episode, but it's true. It's 100% true, and it just blew my mind when I found out about it. I couldn't believe that was real, that the train tracks that I'd heard about for so long was not even in San Antonio, and that there was a peacock farm, and that there were surveyors that actually found out why cars move the way they do, although that never really explains the handprints that people find on their cars, which I personally have a theory on. So hear me out. San Antonio is super haunted. Like, everyone that lives in San Antonio knows San Antonio is super haunted, from bars to railroad tracks to schools to businesses, hospitals. Everywhere you go, someone has seen something at one point or another. And I love my city. I love the culture. I just really, really don't love the murder rate or the death rate, because it's a lot. If you've lived in San Antonio for any amount of time, you know that people passing away in San Antonio happens so much daily that the news is clogged with stories of people passing constantly from all sorts of things all over the city. So my theory is maybe the railroad tracks are haunted. You never know. I've heard plenty of stories of people that have passed away on the train tracks. I have a story that a custodian friend of mine told me once. When we were driving from one school to another, when we were cleaning them, we passed by these railroad tracks that were on the south side of San Antonio, exactly where people say that the bus incident had happened. And he started tearing up a little, and I was like, hey, are you okay? What's going on? And he was like, yeah, sometimes I get a little emotional in this area. And I was like, why is that? He goes, well, you know how I told you the story about how I used to live out here, and that restaurant over there is where me and my buddy would hang out and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I remember that. He was like, well, I never told you about the train tracks there. And I was like, what happened? And he told me about how one day he and his friend were playing by the track, and his friend got hit by a train. and that it really hurt him. This wasn't a ghost story. He wasn't trying to scare me. He wasn't trying to freak me out. He was just genuinely missing his friend who, when they were kids, had an incident there on the tracks. And so honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the railroad tracks where people believe the bus incident happened were really haunted by something else. A lot of these stories slip through the cracks, and people think that, oh, you would hear about it in the newspaper if someone died at the train tracks, but there are so many deaths all the time happening in San Antonio that people don't cover. Not to mention the fact that the Mexican-American War happened in Texas, and that there's so much evidence of people dying in San Antonio near the missions and all around these areas because of what happened. There are many different ways that this area could quite possibly still be haunted, and that's why the San Antonio Railroad tracks belong here with us below the forest floor. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I really enjoyed hanging out with my mom and listening to her personal experiences, and I had a lot of fun telling you guys about mine. Now don't forget, mark your calendars because our next episode is going to be on April 3rd. I hope to see you all there, and I hope you all have a wonderful night. Bye!